Greetings, y'all. So this is the first session of the Ask Aqeel, which is really like more of an informal kind of satsang. So if you're not familiar with what a satsang is, which you might know, it's a gathering around truth. Sat means truth. So what we'll do is we'll take some time to like ask some questions. You can either ask me or we can ask each other, and then we'll reflect on the answers. And, you know, obviously I always have a bunch of things to say, but I don't want to be the one person taking up all this room. So if you have things you want to say, then you can feel free to chime in. Cool. Now you guys are quiet.
We can just ask you anything.
You can ask whatever you want. So what we'll do is we'll start with an Om as usual. So we'll start, because it's traditional to start with Om. So sit tall, close your eyes, notice yourself. The sound of Om, the symbol, represents the infinite. So imagine that you can touch into whatever it is that feels like it's beyond you, because in reality it isn't. It's all present. 3 times, Om, loud and long. May that infinite intelligence that is present equally in all beings, as all beings, guide and protect us as we do this session. Okay, so this is an opportunity to ask any questions about practice or just how to integrate the practices into life, but like you can do nitty-gritty kind of questions like, when I do this, where's my hand supposed to be? Or like more broad philosophical questions. There's no rules to this. And if no one has anything to say or no one has any questions, then I'll, bring in a reading from one of the scriptures or some saint or something, and then we can talk about that. Sound good? Cool. So does anybody have any questions? 0 questions.
I guess I don't have it like as like structured, the question, but talking when you say like being like the awareness that is within each of us and the intelligence that is within each of us, and that practice is what helps us tap into that intelligence within us, and just continue to have struggles and like how to listen to that. And I know that practice is what is gonna shine the light, but I guess if you talk a little bit about how to bring that into the day-to-day and tap into my awareness.
Right. Yeah, that I think you articulated that question very well, as like challenging a question to put into words as that is. So so if I'm hearing you correctly, the question is like, how do I bring this capacity to connect with my own awareness into my everyday experience? And I think there's something I really appreciate about the way you frame this as listening to the intelligence that's there already. And what really is required for us to listen it's not practice, right? We are endowed with this capacity to listen, but what keeps us from doing that often, like I'll speak for myself, right? And many times in conversations, especially when I was younger, before I started practicing so much, I would be listening to a conversation. I would be listening to what someone was saying, but not really listening and waiting for my turn to respond or to speak. And so, what I've had to learn how to do is relinquish this like tendency to rush ahead, to try to organize or categorize or evaluate things as they're happening, and to learn to soften and let things come in the way that they're coming in. And that's how I would answer that question. I'd say practice doesn't really equip us with the capacity to listen. It just teaches us where we're making more effort than is necessary, or we could make a little bit more effort. And I would give you another example. Like when I did one of the trainings with Sri Dharma in the morning, we would have pranayama meditation and then spiritual discourse. And, I don't know if you know this about me, but I'm a kind of a night owl, right? So I don't wake up super duper early on purpose because I worked nights for so many years. And the trainings are like 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. every day, which meant like really you're only getting about 3 or 4 solid hours of sleep, maybe 5. And because you have to eat, right? You don't really eat during the day. And so um, in the mornings, I would find Dharma would be talking about something. He would read a scripture or a passage from one of the scriptures and then giving a discourse on it. And I would find my mind just being like shutting down in sleepiness. And, I had to see myself, I had to catch myself doing that and then use some effort to stay more alert, to be really with what was actually happening. And one trick that I found for that is, especially in listening to what other people are saying, is when someone's speaking, I am repeating what they're saying in my head as they're speaking. So it's like echo mode. They're saying something and I'm repeating it. So I'm really just with whatever is actually being said. And that means I have to set down this other part of myself that's like evaluating and judging and analyzing, which is a hard thing to do. I don't know what your background is, but I think most of us are trained in school or in social settings um, to be like super quick and like have something at the ready and to evaluate everything, but not necessarily in a like critical way, meaning like we take in information and then we put that together with the vast amount of other information we have, and we make associations or we connect ideas together that don't seem like they belong together. And you really can't do that on a dime, so that like with the way we're taught to like be at attention and respond all the time, it like doesn't actually equip us for using this capacity to listen very well. So, my answer in response to that question is like really tuning into the capacity we naturally have to pay attention deeply and to be with what is happening. It doesn't require some extra set of skills. I mean, you can always learn. Like I just gave you 2 techniques you could use, right? Like one was repeat back what someone's saying as they're saying it, and another is consciously catch yourself when you're evaluating things and see if you can suspend from doing that. I mean, you have to ultimately, and it's not a problem that you do. It's just that it often can get in the way. So that's how I would answer that question. Does
I
that
have a
make sense?
follow up. Yes.
Yeah.
What about listening to myself? Like, I think if I were to remove, like I was, as you were saying, I was thinking about just my day to day settings on like work or friends but I sometimes catch myself. It's like, what is the right path or what? And maybe listening to myself is sometimes the,
Mm. Yeah. I mean, that's a that's a separate kind of thing. You know, like what you're actually talking about is um, self-doubt or questioning things unnecessarily because you don't trust them the way that they're showing up, or you don't trust yourself or something, right? And that, like, when I frame it this way to you, that sounds like, no, why would I do that? That's terrible, right? Or like, oh boy, that's me, totally. And and the question really is like, why spend time doing that? What is it that the doubting and the questioning things is actually doing for us? It's it's like two things. One, it's allowing us the opportunity to slow down, which is not bad, right? Sometimes it's useful to slow down and think or feel, like, how is this making me feel? Is this appropriate? Does this feel nourishing? Do I feel like I'm really able to show up fully as myself? And those are good questions to ask. And the other part of it is to see if that is just a habit that's like an energy suck, because it can be safer to question things and to doubt and to freeze than it would be to just take a step forward into something and to be with the uncertainty of things. And that, that's also okay. It's like, I don't know if you were ever, as a kid, you went to a public pool where there's a big diving board. Did you ever do that? I did. And, first of all, with like all the body issues I had as a young person, like that was a whole big thing in itself, and having to deal with that. But then the other thing was like being out in front and exposed to everyone and feeling like, oh boy. And so you climb up on this ladder. And I remember very well being like, I'm on the top of the ladder, I'm at the edge of the diving board, and I'm like, no, no, I'm not going to do it. And then sometimes you jump and sometimes you don't jump. And the thing is, the pool's there either way. You're there, you're dressed for the occasion, you set up the whole situation. You can hang around up on the diving board, but eventually you have to come down either the way you came up or this other way. And the catching ourselves in this habit of like, coming up and then going back down, it's like that's a lot of energy. Actually, it requires less energy just to jump. you know but what's the thing to overcome is that, well, I don't know what's going to happen next. And I think the truth is we really never know what's going to happen next, and that's okay. And so, like, what that comes to is allowing ourselves to be okay with not knowing how things are going to turn out, which is also not part of the way we're enculturated. We're enculturated um to like have expectations or goals and like strive to meet them and accomplish things, and that is like in its own way very debilitating, because that's not how the natural process really works. Like, like a pine tree, for example, with its pine cones, each of those are seeds, right? And they just fall off gradually. The pine tree doesn't know, like, okay, I'm going to make 37 pine cones, and of those 37s, there's like 450 seeds on this, and all out of the 450 seeds, like 75 of them have to become a tree. It doesn't do that, right? But we do it to ourselves. So I think it's like catching ourselves in this habit of like creating difficulties and obstacles for ourselves, which are unnecessary. And that is a use of time and energy. So in the very practical sense, it's like when we feel the wheels spinning, we're not really going anywhere, it's stop spinning the wheel. Use that same energy in a different way, like maybe just jump off the diving board. I don't know if you've noticed or caught on in this last 10 minutes or so, but I mixed so many metaphors together. But that's really the only way we can speak about some of these things. Does that answer the question? Pinecone diving board metaphor.
So, my question is, I don't even know how to phrase it necessarily, but I've been practicing yoga like daily for the past 2 weeks, and I find it really like sitting in meditation and like grounding down and trying to like find center to be really difficult. Like my mind is just like all over the place. It's like I'll be in the middle of like like a mental in my mind, and then I'm like off in a story. Like I'm supposed to be focusing on something, but it's really really difficult. Um, and I am trying not to have judgment about it, but at the same time I'm like, come on, focus. And I'm finding some of the like focusing really difficult, and I'm wondering if you have any tips for that. As well as resistance. Like I'm just like, oh, I'm so over this. I don't want to keep going.
I really appreciate you sharing that. I mean, I think that's like, it's absolutely natural, you know. I think if the mind was like, yeah, let's be quiet and still all the time, like what would we ever get done in this world? You know, so I think that that's completely natural, that our mind is like, well, I'm not going to do this. It seems like the opposite of what I was made for, you know? Like our mind is a machine that makes difference. It's a difference engine, and that engine needs to keep going. And so I think why I really value a lot of the yoga techniques is that they use the same capacity for the mind to be focused on something, to work, because it needs to work. They use the same capacity for the mind to work, but towards focus and towards like openness, um, or even just a specific point. Right? Once the mind has become single pointed, then concentration can happen. So, you know, I think it's helpful just in a broader view to understand like yoga techniques are a process. It's a gradual process. And like the way that it's outlined in the Yoga Sutras is like there's this step-by-step process that you go through. And at the end of that process, the mind is tranquil, it's settled, it is absorbed in the nature of reality. But that's not immediate by any means whatsoever. It's unusual that it would be. And so, you know, as it's laid out, that, and even in the Bhagavad Gita, it's laid out in this way. Like the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says to Ram, or to Arjuna, that it is very unique or very uncommon for someone to reach the divine, that unmanifest and open possible quality of nature. It's very difficult for a person, ordinary person, to reach that without going through a particular channel. That's why there are manifestations of the divine. That's why that there are like these particular ways that we focus. And so, you know, I just want to say like that that's a long way of saying like that's perfectly okay if the mind is like blah, right? It's conditioned to focus on certain things, which is something we can do, but its nature is to be, you know, moving and working. That's like its nature is not to be like uh like a bowl of water just sitting there. You know, it is an ocean roiling. There is this whole world underneath all of that that is happening mostly unconscious. So that's to say that. And so the question about like what I would offer in terms of tips is like, first, like the way that the Yoga Sutras are laid out is like the beginning of the practice of yoga is really the ethical principles, but really compassion. And, you know, when I use this word compassion, it is to recognize that there's a process unfolding in nature exactly correctly, and that that process happens self-guided and without any need for our interference. And so recognizing that means our relationship with things has a much more open and curious quality. So that's where it starts. It starts with practicing compassion in this way. So when the mind is restless like that, you just have to be with your mind like, okay, like I see, like, all right, there's a reason why the mind is focused on a particular kind of story. And there isn't a need to stop it or suppress it or control it, but to allow it within a safe container to go there. So one practice is letting your mind run, like, and that's a hard thing to do because often what happens is the mind runs and then we feel anxious, right? Because there's this slew of thoughts. And so part of it is like you're letting your mind run, but what you're actually doing, what you're doing when you let your mind do that is you're taking notes on your mind. So sort of what the question that was asked before was, is like, how do I listen to myself? Is you actually listen to what your mind is saying. Meaning your mind is thinking about stuff, like catch your thoughts, before it turns into a feeling. Catch the thought and see like, oh, that's an interesting thought, or oh, this thought and this thought are all related. So you're really being diligent about watching what your mind is actually doing, instead of like, I'm supposed to be focused on oming. Like if your mind is going to this place, like watch your mind. That's a whole kind of activity too. Or like if for example, like if you're trying to sit down and meditate and your body feels tense or anxious, or like there's a lot of energy, you need to listen to that and do something with that, and before you can sit down, because otherwise you're fighting yourself. And that's the other part of compassion. The beginning of the practice of yoga is like ahimsa, right? Non-violence. So we have to be able to engage with our process in a way that's not creating or causing violence to ourselves or to anyone. And and that means sometimes your mind's going to go, and it's like painful to watch your mind go, but also like you're safe. Your mind can't take you to a place that it can't go, first of all. Right? It can't go where it can't go. It can't know what it doesn't know, right? It really only is spewing up stuff that it's seen or been exposed to, because it's just like, you know, it's like in a way, it's kind of like a well. There's rainwater coming in. That's like what's on the surface, but then there's water that's deep under the surface that's coming up from underneath. And that stuff underneath, like, you got to go through the stuff at the top before you get down to the bottom of that. And that's okay. Like you have to like go bit by bit and watch and be with the thoughts, and like acknowledge that feelings and thoughts are related to one another, that are in a not one-to-one way, but our feelings are really a product of our thoughts in some way. Like the thoughts that we have evoke a particular kind of feeling about things. And so to be diligent about our thoughts and watch them and be with them. And like sometimes that means like, if you have a story in your head and it's like a fixation of some kind, like write down that story and then look at it and be like, what is that? Do I really need this? So there are ways to work with your mind that are not like, I'm going to sit here and meditate, because that's not always the best way to do it. And I think the thing is to become creative about it, and to allow ourselves to explore, and to really give ourselves permission to have that space to explore it, and not have like, this idea in mind that if I'm practicing yoga, it means I'm sitting in full lotus pose with my eyes closed and like focusing here, because that's what the book said I'm supposed to do, or that's what I saw another teacher said, or something like that. Like, we have this whole concept about these spiritual practices that are like our own individual story we're telling ourselves about that, and it's informed by the stories that other people have told us, and that's informed by their own story, and so on. So it's none of those things. It is your process unfolding exactly as it is. And so I would suggest like give your mind time to wander, and like watch it. Like don't get involved. Like the other thing is, our mind doing this doesn't mean anything. you know, like when we sit down and we like are supposed to be chanting Om or thinking of Om mantra or whatever, and the mind is doing something else, you might have this thought that's like, I'm terrible at meditating, or I'm a terrible yoga practitioner. And that's, you're making that thought rule your activity and make you feel a certain way, whether you're aware of it or not. So I think it's just really allowing your thoughts to become very visible and transparent, and not like these oppressive things, you know? They're not furniture. if you stub your toe on your thought, is your toe going to hurt? No. Does that answer your question? Cool. Yeah, I think these are like very, very practical and widespread things that happen in people that practice any kind of spiritual practice. You know, it's like, I don't think it's straightforward. We don't have like a manual, even though it seems like we do. Like the way, if you've ever done yoga teacher training, or you ever been in a yoga studio that has books, or you've gone to a bookstore about yoga, right? It makes it seem like it's just cut and dry. Like this is just formula, right? You just plug in the formula and then peace comes out. But that's not how it works. You know, like I think that probably the most valuable thing that I've learned through my process is to give myself permission to pay attention to all the places where I won't let peace come out. Meaning all the places where I am holding tension, and like to recognize like this is a product of like eons of habits, you know, and socialized conditioning and genetic conditioning and all this stuff. It's all together. It's so complex. So it's not like, you know, obvious how to unwind all that. And I think the point is you go thread by thread and you slowly start pulling things out. And the more you pull out, the more you realize, oh man, there's a lot of shit in there. And like this process doesn't seem to be ending. But what ends up happening is there's more and more and more space on the other side of the discomfort of engaging with that process. And all we really need is to give ourselves permission to go there, you know, to not get ahead of ourselves or become discouraged because our process doesn't look like someone else's, you know?
In one of your, a few weeks ago, you mentioned something, and I'm trying to remember how you said it. It was when you have this thought, it's like about like, oh, I'm like concentrate. I'm not like being compassionate with yourself. You had mentioned like do the opposite, or like, I can't remember how it was, but it was like, could you maybe repeat that? Because obviously that didn't stick with me. But I remember vividly that it was like knitted with like the opposite, or the do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yes, I do. So what you're asking about is a passage from the Yoga Sutras that's called, the technique that's given is called Paripaksha Bhavanam, which is, I think I haven't looked at the Yoga Sutras in a while, so I better look again. I think that's in this first pada. So that's a technique that's given that says, you know, one way to approach the fluctuations of the mind is you meet that particular fluctuation with its opposite. It's sort of like noise canceling, right? You know how noise canceling works? It's actually a noise that cancels out another noise, you know? So it's taking whatever frequency that is and mirroring it and then reversing it so that that negates itself. And that's the idea behind it, right? So it's, you have a particular thought and you meet that thought with its mirror image, which you could say is its opposite, and it's translated often as its opposite. But what I would say is it's not so much its opposite as whatever will neutralize it. You know, so for example, say say you and I were sitting down at dinner, and there were like 6 cookies for desserts, right? And you ate 4 of the cookies, and I only got 2. And then my mind becomes very agitated because my mind's like, hey, I like cookies. Did she not know I like cookies? She must be a jerk. There's something wrong with her. And then I start feeling this kind of way about you, and this whole interaction, I feel this whole kind of way about it, and I'm all worked up. I might not say anything, but all this is happening inside, before I've actually done something. That whole process is underway inside, and it can happen like, super fast. And what this practice of Pratipakshibhavana is saying is, if you catch your thought and then you meet it with its opposite and say, oh, maybe she really loves cookies. Like, oh, wonderful. She loves cookies so much. I love cookies. I love how much she loves cookies. And then I feel a completely different way. My whole attitude is different, And it's not to say like you put on the rose-colored glasses and say like, for example, in such this can get dangerous in situations where there's some kind of abuse happening, right? Which does happen in spiritual communities. That's why like it's really tricky, right? So that's why discernment is so important, or understanding the capacity between what our mind is making up and what's actually happening. So, it can get dangerous when someone is causing us real harm, and then we use this technique to say, oh, but they love me so much and I love them. And that can get really tricky. So I think it's understanding what kinds of things to apply that to is also part of the practice. And what it says is that if you practice this very, diligently, it becomes automatic for you, which means you don't have to do that anymore. It's not a conscious process that happens. What happens is your thoughts negate themselves before a particular kind of behavior or feeling or story emerges. It's like you have steeped yourself in this process so much that you recognize my thoughts are just patterns, and there's a pattern that neutralizes every pattern. And so really, like, I don't really even need to interact with that because it's just noise. And this is something that I think is like, it's gradual. It's also, like I said, it's tricky. You have to use discernment to know when to apply that, because it's not always appropriate. I like, in order of operations, what I would say of how to deal with your thoughts, and don't, this is all being recorded, but don't quote me. But so the order of operations would be, is this helpful or harmful for me or for anyone else? That's the beginning. That's where you start. Is this helpful or harmful? And then like what are the consequences, or what is the result of holding on to this thought the way that it is? What is the feeling it creates in me? What actions am I motivated to take? And what happens as a result of all of that? Right? So these questions to ask ourselves really untangle this web that we make with our thoughts and feelings. There's a pattern in which all of this stuff plays out, and to then slow it down and to be able to catch your thought, see where your thought's coming from, what it's related to, whether it's helpful or harmful, what happens when you entertain this thought. To do that is a whole process. So, I would just say like there's ways to approach these experiences that we have all the time with a lot more spaciousness and curiosity, and a lot less judgment and pressure. It doesn't have to be so intense. Someone just came to our house to drop off a bunch of baby stuff, so there's like, oh, going on downstairs. So, so yeah, I mean, I think like that, like I'm so grateful that you're asking these kinds of questions because they're so valuable, right? Especially with the like we live with so much personal responsibility and so much going on with us all the time. It's hard to remember, you know, to give ourselves that space. I think I got glitchy, right? Yeah. Is it better? Cool. Okay, so I think the best way to end this, because we're coming up on time now, the best way to end it is, you know, like unless there's any other burning questions, right? Unless there's any other burning questions, we should just sit for a few moments, you know, and like try this out. Let your mind run for a little while and see what that's like. Just let your mind just go. Don't try to control it. Don't add any weight to anything. Just let your mind do what it's doing and see what happens. We'll do this for like 5 minutes or so, and then we'll close with an Om. And if your mind is wandering, let it wander. That's the point. But just watch it. See what your mind is up to. what all these practices are teaching us is that even though there's all this movement of body, mind, energy, this whole cosmos is moving and unfolding, underneath all of that is an openness, a stillness. And that is present all the time. So we'll conclude with one Om and three Shanti. Shanti means peace. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. May we be receptive to that intelligence, that stillness that is present already all the time. That is our nature. Some people call that God. Be receptive to the grace of God. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.